What is up, guys? Welcome back to another video on Pure Panorama, and this one is good. We finally got the exhaust housing separated off the HX35 Turbo, so we are able to utilize the rebuild kit that we got for it. As you know, I did get an HX35 rebuild kit from Diesel Auto Power a little while back. I've been fighting the exhaust housing on this HX35 Turbo for quite some time now, trying to get it separated and having no luck. I've been hitting it with PB Blaster penetrating oil, hitting it with an acetylene torch, beating it with a big frickin' hammer and a dead blow, a 45-ounce dead blow, and none of that stuff has let us have any success as far as getting this exhaust housing off this flippin' turbo. Today was the day though, and let me tell you, I'm a little pumped because I had woken up, I came out in the garage starting to putz around a little bit, just cleaning things up, started messing with some injectors. Is the old 24 valve Cummins getting another set of injectors? I don't know, you'll have to find out. But when I was messing with the injectors, I couldn't help but notice the HX35 Turbo that I had to keep stepping over in the garage, and I finally said, you know what, since when am I someone to let something defeat me? No, it ain't working that way. So I flipped it upside down onto the compressor housing again. Well, you know what, I've got stuff recorded of it. I'm just gonna go ahead and show you exactly how I did it, and I'll just show you what I recorded as I was doing it. So here you go, enjoy the footage, and I will see you guys at the end. Yes! Finally, we got the exhaust housing off the HX35 Turbo. Oh, you have no idea how good that feels. So I did my morning routine. I got up, did my thing, ate some breakfast, came out into the garage, and started to get into some stuff with injectors. Stay tuned for that, because I think what I have planned is, it sounds cool anyways. But anyways, I was looking at this HX35 Turbo sitting here on the ground, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I had to give it another go. So I pulled out the old penetrating oil, the PB Blaster, I got out the old acetylene torch, and I pulled out the BFH, the big fucking hammer. See, I just saved myself time in editing. I flipped the turbo upside down on the compressor housing so that the turbine housing and the exhaust housing was facing upward, and I started to spray the crap out of it with that PB Blaster. Just let it soak for a good 20 minutes or so, and remind you, I've already soaked this thing plenty times. I've gone through about 1.5 cans of penetrant on it, and we just let it sit there, we let it soak. I pulled out the acetylene torch, I sparked her up, we heated the crap out of the outside of the exhaust housing, and we started giving it some wax, exercising that BFH on the old HX35 Turbo, and I'll go over a little bit more in depth and show you more up close what I was doing. But anyways, I noticed that when you do it, and I'll explain this a little bit more when I'm showing you the turbo up close, but when you do it, you want to make sure that the compressor wheel and the turbine remain free and are able to spin. I noticed that they were starting to get a little stiff, and I wasn't able to spin them, so that told me that the exhaust housing was starting to shimmy a little bit. It was starting to move just a tad bit. So I continued to do what I was doing. I sprayed it down a little bit more, took the BFH again, gave it a few more love taps, if you will, and I noticed that it wouldn't move at all at that point. Now let's go in the garage and I'll give you a closer look at this HX35 Turbo so you can see exactly how I did this. So if you look right now, you can see if I spin the compressor wheel with my finger, she's still spinning. You don't hear really any noise. You hear a little bit of a humming because the turbine is barely lightly scraping the exhaust housing in there, but it is more freed up than it was just 10 minutes ago. And if we flip this over and we look down in there to spin the turbine wheel, you can see we got good movement. It doesn't appear to be bent, so the shaft doesn't seem to be bent at all. It looks like we are good, and I should, well, it's a little locked up. I need to have 2 hands to do it, and I think all the weight sitting down on it right now isn't going to allow me to spin it. But we do have this thing broken free, and here's how I did it. So on your HX35, you are going to have a couple of bands right here, and there's 4. These are 1/2 inch. You need a 1/2 inch wrench to break these loose. So start to finish, what you want is penetrant so that you can soak these down. Maybe, honestly, depending on how long the HX35 Turbo has been on your Cummins truck, you would want to heat these up just a touch with a torch, and these will break free no problem. I had no issue breaking these free a little while back. So penetrant, if you can't get them with just the penetrating oil, like I said, a little bit of heat and a 1/2 inch wrench, these will pop free. Now, I removed these bands here completely at first, and then decided to put them back on so that when I was hitting on the exhaust housing, if it did decide to break free, that it wouldn't just drop and A, break my toe, or B, smack the fins on the turbine and bend one all up and just make it all wonky, and then I would have to buy a new turbine or actually a whole new shaft. So that was my idea anyways, and it ended up being good. It worked and it was perfect. So at that point, I decided to, like I said, just flip it back up onto the face here of the compressor housing where you would hook up your air intake to, and I just sprayed the crap out of it with the good old trusty PB blaster. As you can see, we got a 45 ounce dead blow hammer there. We got a good 3-pound shop mallet hammer here. That's the BFH that actually got the job done. And now I'm gonna show you how I held it and what I was doing in order to get this accomplished. So after I heated the HX35 Turbo up with the acetylene torch over here on the floor, I literally just held onto the compressor housing like this, had it pressed up against my waistband, took the hammer, and I wasn't wailing on it and smashing it. I literally was just giving it some good taps like this. A little bit harder than that, but you guys if you try to do this, you'll get a good feel for how hard you need to hit this thing. Watch out for your fingers, because I did clip mine just a couple of times. I do suggest wearing gloves, and mine aren't really padded or anything, but definitely wear some gloves and just hit here. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna flip the whole turbo around. So now we have the HX35 flipped around 180 degrees, and you're gonna hit on the opposite side. And then I just kept rotating the turbo 180 degrees, and I kept giving it some love taps on the opposite side of the exhaust housing, and voila, I noticed you was starting to move. So you guys know that I've been battling with this HX35 Turbo now for quite a while, trying to get this exhaust housing separated off of the bearing housing. And as you can see, we finally got it done. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull these 1/2 inch bolts out. You can't get 2 of them out because you have the oil inlet and outlet, and it won't allow them to come out until you have the whole exhaust housing removed off of the turbo. But you can get 2 of them out, and then you can remove these bands right out of the way. And I do have paint marks here on each side of it just to show me where it was clocked to, so that when we put it back together, we know exactly how it needs to be clocked for when it goes back on the truck, so that we can line up our intercooler piping and all that stuff to it. So I'm actually gonna grab the paint marker real quick, and I'm gonna make a couple more marks here so I know which lines go where and which ones need to meet up. And then we're gonna go ahead and get these 1/2 inch bolts out of these sides here, pull these bands out, and then finally, we're gonna remove this exhaust housing off of this HX35 Turbo. Here we go. So as you can see there, we just take out these little bolts, and they are some tiny stubby little guys. So you just pop those out, and then you can remove both of these little bands there. I do have the rebuild kit for the HX35 upstairs in my room, and I've really wanted to dive into doing the turbo rebuild myself. I was basically talking with Turbo Lab of America because I do want to have it machined out so that we have a bigger turbo for the 24 valve Cummins. But I was getting to a point where I was frustrated, and I wanted to just send it right out and have it done because I could not get this exhaust housing off the HX35. but now that we seem to have it freed up a little bit and moving, I think that we may have to just dive into it and try to give it a rebuild on our own here and see how it goes. I'm gonna make 2 more marks on this side with the paint pen, just so I know how this thing lines back up to itself. So we got 2 little arrows over here that match up. On the other side, I simply just drew the letter I. So on this side of the exhaust housing, where the flange is that meets your exhaust manifold, I drew the letter I onto the bearing housing and the exhaust housing, so I know that these 2 lines have to match up when we put this thing back together. On this side, I just drew an arrow on the exhaust housing and the bearing housing, and we obviously know that those 2 have to match up when we put it back together. And if you look down in here, you can see this little lip, like this little collar right here. That's our indication that this thing has finally started to budge and pop free, because that is the lip of the bearing housing right there, and it usually sits flush with this exhaust housing, but not anymore. We finally got her cracked free, and we are going to try to remove it 100% right now and take a look. Looks like once we can get it lifted up a little bit, it looks like we're gonna have to pull these little 1/2-inch bolts out, because I think that they might be catching on the lip there of the bearing housing. So let's get rid of these things, and I think we should be able to take her off. There we go. Exhaust housing is free. You have no idea how good that feels. And sometime in the process, we did bend the little tab here for our wastegate actuator, so I'm gonna have to straighten that back out as well, but that is no big deal. There you go, guys. You can see what the turbine wheel of an HX35 looks like now. And this is the heat shield. So this is the culprit right here that gets stuck inside of the exhaust housing, which is this little shield right here that I'm spinning, and I'll show you this close up in a second. But what happens is there's a collar that it rests on down inside the exhaust housing, and after being on a truck for however long, this thing had been on a truck for years until I bought it, it just rusts and seizes up, and it gets itself welded to the exhaust housing, which is why you just use a crap ton of penetrating oil, hit it with a little heat if you have to, just around the edge of the exhaust housing here, and then give it a few whacks with a BFH, and you should be able to bust her free. Don't get frustrated like I did. I was literally about to throw in the towel and quit a little early, but it will separate, and this actually doesn't look like it's in that bad a condition. I'm definitely glad that we did not give up, and I decided to give this one more shot here this morning, because look at that. It paid off. We got the HX35 opened up. The compressor housing comes off very easily by removing this big clamp right here, this big circlip. You just remove it with some channel locks. They do make a special retaining ring, snap ring pliers for a clamp this big, a clip that big, but you don't need it. You can use a simple pair of channel locks, and it will pop that thing out, and then you can lift the whole turbo bearing assembly right up out of the compressor housing. And you guys know that I've already had that off, because you saw me starting to sand down cast marks and starting to get it cleaned up previously in a video. So now that we have this exhaust housing out here in some better daylight where you can see it, you can see my marks here and here, exactly 180 degrees opposite of one another. And this right here is where the heat shield that is just below the turbine wheel on the bearing housing, that's where the heat shield rests, and that is what gets rusted and welded to the heat shield and makes these things so hard to separate after they've been on a truck for so long. So if we get right down in there a little closer, you can see all that stuff that just needs to get cleaned off of there. That thing really just needs to get cleaned down so that it is in better shape for when we put it back together. But you can definitely see why it was stuck. If we flip her up like so, This is where the actual turbine rides, right down in here. She spins around in there like so. And that's basically all there is. This is your wastegate actuator. So when the wastegate is doing its thing and opens, it lifts this up just a touch so that you are not over boosting the truck. And that's it, guys. We're gonna give this thing a good clean down with some brake clean and just try to clean her up, get it painted so that it looks more presentable and looks cleaner. And I am most excited to go ahead and tear into this bearing housing and start to dismantle this puppy. Because now that we got the exhaust housing off the HX35, I definitely have to separate it and open it all up, put the rebuild kit that I have into it, and then see how it is after we get all that done. And then after that, we'll make the call of whether or not it goes on the truck for a little bit, or we just send it out to Turbo Lab of America and let them do their thing. But either way, this HX35 will go to Turbo Lab of America at some point soon and get itself some love. All right, so now we got the bearing assembly out here with the compressor housing still attached to it, and she's dirty. I did have this thing cleaned down a little bit, but I still have plenty more work to do on this to get it where I want it so that we can paint it and have it look good on the truck. But here you go. That is the heat shield right there that I showed you on the exhaust housing where it rides down in there. That sits under the turbine here, as you can see. It really doesn't look that bad. It actually looks like it's in pretty decent shape, as if this turbo may have been separated once before and possibly rebuilt at some point. I'm trying to get a look at the actual turbine when we're spinning it now that we have it separated and we can see it better, to see if it looks like the shaft might be bent at all, and it doesn't appear to be. It looks like it spins pretty nicely and evenly. So that is a good thing. It doesn't look like the shaft is bent or anything on this HX35, and we did not damage any of the fins on the turbine here, so you can see that they are still all whole, they're intact, and they don't have any chips out of them. The corners of the fins are not bent in any way, and she still spins pretty nicely. That is one thing you do need to look out for when you're separating it and you are holding on to the compressor housing here and you have it pressed against your waistband and you're hitting it with the hammer like I showed you. You do want to stop in between each time that you are rotating it to hit the opposite side. You want to stop and see, you want to try and spin the turbine, and you want to spin the compressor wheel and see if you can still move them. If they are seized up and they're pressed against the wall of the compressor housing or the exhaust housing, then you obviously want to flip it. You want to hit opposite of where you just were and try to loosen it back up so you can spin it, but don't hit too much on one side if it is jammed up, because you will bend and damage the fins on either one of the wheels, more so on the turbine here, because you're smacking the exhaust housing than you would the compressor wheel. But you could also bend the shaft that they're both connected to, and you don't want that, because then it's going to cost you more to rebuild, because you're going to have to buy a new cartridge for it or shaft. All right, man, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you guys are pumped that I finally got that separated. That means that we can do the rebuild of the turbo, the HX35 turbo, here on the channel now, and have a rebuild video of that. So any of you guys who have an HX35 on one of your trucks, whether it's a 12 valve or a manual 98.5 02 model Cummins, there's a good chance then that you do have an HX35 turbo. Or if you have an automatic version of the 24 valve and you have a HY35 and you're looking to do an HX35 turbo upgrade on the truck, then you might be able to benefit from watching a rebuild on this as well. Now, this will be the first one that I've rebuilt, but I think we can get it done and get that out there for you guys. So I'm super stoked to finally have that exhaust housing off of there. It was a bear. It did fight me a little bit, but I started to just get a little bit smarter and figure out some other tactics as far as trying to get that thing separated and what else I could do, and just stayed persistent, man. And honestly, today I think I only spent a matter of like 20 minutes on it before I realized that the turbine and the compressor were getting a little jammed up when I was trying to rotate them and spin them. And so I knew that that thing, like I said, was moving, and I I smacked it around a little bit more and finally just grabbed it with my hand and noticed that she was pop free. So that's it for this video. We can get that compressor housing off now, get the bearing housing out of there and start to take that thing apart, get a video done on that, and we can just keep moving forward with it. And eventually, yeah, it's still gonna get built from Turbo Lab of America and have that machine work done. So don't anybody think that that's not gonna happen, because it will. Leave a big like on this video if you are as pumped as I am about this HX35 Turbo, and if you're stopping in for the first time, do subscribe, because there's more coming with this HX35, and we got a whole lot of stuff still to do with the 24 valve Cummins behind me. You're not gonna wanna miss that. You do wanna be a part of it, so just hit the subscribe button, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace. I just wanna